My name is Larkin Devereux, and 3 years ago my husband had an affair with my younger sister. That part of the story most people who know my family already know. What almost nobody knows is what actually happened in the 3 years since, because I let my whole family believe a version of my life that was never true, and I let them believe it right up until the night my sister looked me dead in the eye at our mother's birthday dinner and said something that finally made me stop letting it slide, once and for all. Quick bit about who I am first. I'm 39 years old, I live in Savannah, Georgia, and I own a furniture restoration business I built almost entirely from scratch over the last 3 years, working out of a converted warehouse in the historic district. My hands are calloused now in a way they never used to be, and honestly, I'm proud of that. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Keep in mind, as this story unfolds, that everything my family assumed about me during those 3 years was wrong, and they had absolutely no idea just how wrong until that dinner. I should explain a little about my marriage first, because I think it matters for understanding everything that came after. I married Grant Pemberton when I was 32. He worked in commercial real estate, successful, charming, exactly the kind of man my family approved of on sight. What nobody saw, not my mother, not my sister, was how tightly he controlled our household finances almost from the start, how he discouraged my restoration work as a cute little hobby that wasn't worth taking seriously, how small, steady pressure over years had slowly made me smaller too, without my even fully noticing it happening. The affair, when I finally discovered it, felt almost like the visible tip of something that had been eroding underneath the surface for a long time already. My mother, Delphine, throws a birthday dinner every September, the same tradition our families kept my entire life. Everyone gathered around her long dining table with more food than anyone needs and conversation that always skates carefully around anything uncomfortable. I almost didn't go this year. I'd heard, through the family grapevine that never quite stops running, that my sister Odalise would be there. With Grant. I want to be clear about something before I go further. Odalise is my younger sister. Grant is my ex-husband. 3 years ago, I found out they'd been having an affair for nearly 8 months, right under my nose, at family gatherings almost exactly like the one I was walking into that night. The marriage ended fast after that. Odalise and Grant got married themselves about a year later. And my family, in the aftermath of all of it, quietly settled into a story about me that I never bothered to correct. Poor Larkin. Never really recovered. Still alone after all this time. It was easier, honestly, to let that story stand than to explain a truth I wasn't sure any of them were ready to actually hear. I walked into my mother's house that evening in a paint-stained work shirt I hadn't bothered to change out of, because I'd come straight from the shop, sawdust still faintly clinging to my sleeves, and the first person I saw when I stepped into the dining room was Odalise, seated at the table already, Grant beside her, both of them looking exactly like the kind of couple who spent real money on how they presented themselves to a room. Everything about the way they sat, the way they'd angled their chairs slightly toward the center of the table, suggested people who'd rehearsed, even if only unconsciously, exactly the image they wanted the evening to project. Larkin. Odalise stood to hug me, the kind of hug that's more performance than affection. You look like you came straight from work. I did. Still doing the furniture thing? She said it the way you'd ask someone if they still had that little hobby, still that adorable little pastime. That's sweet. Keeps you busy, I'm sure. I let that go. I'd let 100 small comments like that go over the last 3 years, telling myself it wasn't worth the energy, that my family would eventually see whatever they needed to see on their own timeline. I sat down across from her, my mother fussing over the table settings the way she always does when she's nervous about how an evening might go. Dinner moved along the way these things always do in my family, careful and surface level, conversation drifting between Odalise and Grant's recent kitchen renovation and my mother's garden club, everyone very carefully avoiding the one topic sitting at the center of the table like an unlit candle nobody wanted to acknowledge. I mostly stayed quiet, the way I usually did at these gatherings now, content to let the evening pass without incident. Then, at dessert, when Odalise, 2 glasses of wine into the evening, leaned back in her chair and looked at me with an expression I recognized instantly. Pity, dressed up as concern. Can I ask you something, she said. And I mean this with love, Larkin, I really do. Are you doing okay? Like, actually okay? Because it's been 3 years, and you're still single. I just worry about you sometimes. The table went quiet in that particular way a room goes quiet when everyone's suddenly very interested in their plates. I saw my mother's hand tighten slightly around her wine glass, the way it always did when a conversation started sliding towards somewhere she'd rather it didn't go. I'm doing fine, Odalise. I'm not trying to be mean. I know how hard it was for you, everything that happened. I sometimes wonder if you ever really moved past it. If maybe you're still holding on to something. She glanced at Grant, just briefly, something proud and a little smug in the look of a woman who needed the room to understand she'd won something. I just want you to be happy, that's all. If you've ever had someone in your family mock you with a comment dressed up as concern, I think you already understand exactly the particular kind of sting I felt sitting at that table, in a room full of people who'd quietly decided, for 3 years, that they understood my life better than I did. This is exactly the kind of story we tell every single day here on Com Stories Drama, real families, real quiet cruelty, secrets that finally come out once someone decides they're done staying silent. If you're the kind of person who's ever had to sit through a moment like this, go ahead and subscribe right now, turn on that notification bell. Because what Odalise didn't know that night was so much bigger than anything she was assuming. My phone buzzed in my pocket right as she finished talking, and I glanced down at the screen out of habit more than anything, and saw a name I recognized immediately. Marcus Whitfield, one of my biggest clients, a local interior designer who'd been sending me steady, high-end work for over a year, the kind of work that had quietly, steadily transformed my small side project into something that now had its own payroll, its own waiting list, its own momentum I hadn't ever let my family see up close. I need to take this, I said, standing up, my mother's confused eyes following me as I stepped out onto the porch. The call was quick, just Marcus confirming a delivery date for a set of restored dining chairs headed to a client in Atlanta, but I stood out there a moment longer than necessary after we hung up, the September evening cool against my skin, looking back through the window at my family's table, at Odalise laughing at something Grant had said, at my mother's careful, practiced smile, and felt something settle in me that had been building for 3 years. I thought about the buyout offer sitting in a drawer in my office, an offer worth more than the entire value of my divorce settlement, an offer I'd turned down without telling a single member of my family, because I hadn't wanted their opinions about a decision that was entirely mine to make. I thought about how easy it had been, these last 3 years, to simply let everyone believe whatever comfortable story required the least explanation from me. I walked back inside, sat back down at that table, and for the first time in 3 years, decided I was done letting the story stand the way everyone had assumed it. Whatever came next, whatever it cost me to finally say it out loud, I was tired of being the family's quiet cautionary tale when the truth was something entirely different. I sat back down at the table and didn't say anything right away, letting the conversation drift back to safer topics while I decided exactly how I wanted to do this. I'd spent 3 years choosing silence. I wasn't going to throw that away with something messy or reactive. If I was finally going to correct the record, I wanted to do it the way I'd built everything else the last 3 years, carefully, deliberately, on my own terms. I watched Odalise across the table, still glowing slightly from whatever satisfaction she'd taken from her earlier comment, and felt something in me settle into a kind of calm I hadn't expected to find so easily. Can I ask you something, I said, once there was a lull in the conversation. Odalise, what exactly do you think I've been doing for the last 3 years? She looked mildly confused by the question, setting down her wine glass, the confidence from earlier faltering slightly under the sudden shift in my tone. What do you mean? I mean, I know you've got the furniture thing. I just meant, I worry that you never really moved on. From Grant. From everything. From Grant, I repeated slowly, letting the words sit in the air for a moment. You think I'm still hung up on Grant? Aren't you? I mean, it's been 3 years, and you haven't dated anyone, not that I know of, you're still living kind of small, still doing this whole, I don't know, rebuilding thing. I just want you to actually be happy, Larkin, that's all I'm saying. I felt my mother's eyes on me from across the table, tense, clearly hoping I'd let this go the way I always had before, her hand still tied around the stem of her wine glass. I didn't. Whatever discomfort this caused, I was tired of managing everyone else's comfort at the expense of my own truth. I turned down a serious relationship about a year ago, I said. A really good one, actually. Not because I'm hung up on my ex-husband. Because I was building something that mattered more to me right then, and I didn't want to slow it down for anyone, not even someone I genuinely cared about. Odalise blinked. Building what, exactly? My business. Which, by the way, isn't the little furniture thing you keep referring to. It's a full workshop now. 6 employees. A client list that includes some of the biggest interior design firms in 3 states. I kept my voice level, calm, the same voice I used explaining a restoration timeline to a client. 6 months ago, I got a buyout offer for the business worth more than the entire value of the divorce settlement grant and I split. I turned it down. The table had gone completely silent now. Even Grant, who'd mostly stayed quiet through dinner, was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between surprise and the particular discomfort of a man realizing he'd badly underestimated something he'd once dismissed outright. You turned down, how much money are we talking about? Odalise asked, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. That's not really the point, Odalise. The point is that I haven't spent 3 years falling apart over Grant. I spent 3 years building something real, on purpose, because for the first time in a long time, I got to make decisions entirely for myself, without anyone deciding for me what was practical, or serious, or worth taking seriously. I glanced briefly at Grant as I said that last part, and watched something flicker across his face, recognition, maybe, of exactly what I was referencing. If you've ever had to sit in a room and correct 3 years of assumptions people made about you, all at once, I think you understand exactly the strange mixture of relief and exposure I felt at that table. This is exactly the kind of story we tell every single day here on Calm Stories Drama, real families, quiet resilience, secrets finally coming into the light after years of silence. Here's a question I'd love to know your honest answer to. If your own sister mocked you for years, believing a story about your life that was completely wrong, would you correct her right there at the table, the way I did? Or would you keep letting her believe whatever made her comfortable? I read every comment, and if this story has you invested, go ahead and hit that like button, because there's more to this than even I expected sitting at that table. My mother finally spoke, her voice careful, almost apologetic, her eyes moving between Odalise and me like she was trying to figure out how to manage a conversation that had clearly moved beyond anything she knew how to smooth over. Larkin, honey, why didn't you ever tell us any of this? Because nobody ever really asked, I said. Everyone just assumed. It was easier to let the assumption stand than to keep correcting people who'd already decided what my life looked like. Every time I tried, early on, I got the sense nobody really wanted the correction. They wanted the simpler story. So eventually I just stopped offering it. My mother had no response to that, and I watched her look down at her plate, something like guilt crossing her face, quick and then carefully put away. Odalise was quiet for a long moment after that, something complicated moving across her face, and when she finally spoke again, her voice had lost the smug edge from earlier entirely. I didn't know any of that, she said quietly. I really didn't, Larkin. I guess I needed you to still be, I don't know, struggling. It made things feel more okay, somehow. Like I hadn't actually taken something good away from you, if you were still just sad about it 3 years later. It was the most honest thing I'd heard my sister say in years, and something in the admission caught me completely off guard, softening an anger I'd been carrying into the dinner without fully naming it. I'd expected defensiveness, maybe even denial. I hadn't expected something that sounded, underneath all the years of careful posturing, almost like vulnerability. Is that why you needed to say what you said tonight? I asked. Because you needed me to still be broken? She didn't answer right away, her eyes flicking briefly toward Grant, who had gone very quiet, very still, in a way that suddenly felt significant in a way I couldn't quite place yet, his fork resting untouched against his plate. "Things haven't been easy, exactly," she said finally, carefully, like she was choosing each word from a very narrow set of acceptable options, glancing again toward Grant as if checking whether it was safe to keep going. "With Grant. Financially, I mean. He handles most of it, and sometimes I feel like I don't have a full picture of everything." I felt something cold settle in my stomach, a recognition I hadn't expected to feel that night, sitting across from the sister who'd taken my husband 3 years earlier. "What do you mean he handles most of it?" "I mean, he manages the accounts. Says it's simpler that way, since he's better with the numbers." She said it lightly, the way you'd describe something you'd trained yourself not to think about too hard, her eyes not quite meeting mine. "It's fine. It's just how we've always done it." I looked at my sister across that table, at the careful, practiced way she'd just described something that sounded, uncomfortably, painfully familiar, and understood, with a certainty that settled somewhere deep in my chest, that whatever was happening in her marriage right now might be a lot closer to what I'd survived than either of us had realized until this exact moment. I thought about all the small, reasonable-sounding explanations Grant had given me, over years, for why I shouldn't need my own accounts, my own decisions, my own financial footing, and heard, almost word for word, the same quiet logic in my sister's careful description of her own marriage. "Odalise," I said slowly, "do you have access to your own accounts? Right now, this second, could you check your own balance without going through him first?" She opened her mouth to answer, and then, for the first time all evening, said nothing at all. The silence stretched on long enough that I watched something shift in her expression, some quiet, dawning recognition she clearly wasn't ready to fully face yet, not at that table, not in front of Grant, not in front of our mother. Grant cleared his throat, the first sound he'd made in several minutes. "I don't think this is really the conversation for tonight," he said, his voice carrying that same smooth, reasonable tone I remembered so well from years of marriage, the tone he always used right before redirecting a conversation away from anything that might actually require him to answer for something. I looked at him for a long moment, feeling, for the first time in 3 years, something close to clarity about exactly what I'd survived, and exactly what my sister might now be walking straight into without fully understanding it yet. "Maybe not tonight," I said quietly. "But it's a conversation someone needs to have with you eventually, Odalise. And I don't think it should be me who has to be the one to force it." Grant left the table not long after that, muttering something about getting air, and the dinner dissolved into an awkward, unfinished quiet that none of us seemed to know how to fill. My mother started clearing plates that weren't finished, the way she always did when she needed her hands busy more than she needed the dishes cleared, her movements quick and slightly too efficient, the way a person moves when they're trying not to think about what just happened. Odalise sat very still, staring at the space where Grant had been sitting, something working itself out behind her eyes that I recognized, uncomfortably, from my own kitchen table 3 years earlier. I didn't leave right away. Some part of me wanted to let the evening end on the correction I'd already made and go back to my quiet, self-built life. But another part of me, a part that had spent 3 years learning what it actually meant to build something honest, stayed instead. "Can we talk?" I said quietly to Odalise, once my mother had disappeared into the kitchen. "Just us. For a minute." She nodded, and we stepped out onto the same porch I'd stood on earlier that night, the September air cooler now, the party noise from inside muffled behind the closed door, just the two of us standing in the kind of quiet we hadn't shared, really shared, in over 3 years. "I'm not trying to blow up your marriage," I said. "I want to be clear about that. This isn't revenge, Odalise. I'm not trying to get back at you for what happened 3 years ago by scaring you about your own relationship. Then what are you trying to do?" "I'm trying to ask you a question I wish someone had asked me, a long time before I finally had to ask it myself. Do you actually feel safe in your marriage? Not comfortable. Not taken care of. Safe. Like you could leave, right now, tomorrow, and be completely fine, financially and otherwise, if you needed to." She was quiet for a long time, her arms wrapped around herself against the chill, and when she finally spoke, her voice had none of the confidence I'd grown up watching her wield so effortlessly. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've never really let myself think about it that directly." "That's exactly how it started for me too," I said. "Not knowing was easier than knowing, for a long time. Grant made it easy not to know. Every question I had a reasonable answer waiting for it. Every concern, a logical explanation. It took me years to understand that reasonable explanations, over and over, for the same pattern, isn't actually the same thing as an honest marriage. If you've ever recognized a pattern of harm in someone else's relationship because you'd already lived through it yourself, I think you understand exactly the strange, unwelcome clarity I felt standing on that porch with my sister. This is exactly the kind of story we tell every single day here on Calm Stories Drama, real families, hard truths, patterns that repeat themselves until someone finally breaks the silence around them. If this story has you thinking about someone in your own life right now, go ahead and hit that like button and let me know in the comments, and remember, we release a brand new true story just like this one every single day. "Why didn't you ever tell any of us this?" Odalise asked quietly. "About what it was actually like with Grant. Before everything happened. Would you have believed me? 3 years ago, if I'd told you Grant was controlling, that he made me feel small in ways I couldn't always articulate, would you have believed that over the version of him you were already falling for?" She didn't answer, and I think we both already knew the honest answer was no. "I'm not telling you any of this to make you feel guilty," I said. "I'm telling you because I think you're standing exactly where I stood 3 years ago, and I don't want you to spend 3 more years finding your own way out of it the hard way, the way I had to." Odalise was crying quietly now, the porch light catching the tears she wasn't bothering to wipe away. "I don't know what to do with any of this. You don't have to know tonight. You don't have to do anything tonight. Just start paying attention. Start asking the questions you've been avoiding. That's all I'm asking." We stood out there a while longer, the two of us, in a kind of quiet neither of us had shared in years, something shifting slowly between sisters who'd spent 3 years defined entirely by a betrayal neither of us had fully processed until that porch. My mother came to my workshop 2 weeks later, unannounced, something she'd never once done in 3 years of my running the business. She stood in the doorway taking in the space, the tall windows, the tables of restored furniture waiting for delivery, my employees moving efficiently through the kind of routine I'd built entirely on my own, and I watched her face as she took it all in, a slow, dawning recognition of exactly how much she'd never bothered to see. "I had no idea," she said quietly. "Any of this. I feel terrible, Larkin, that we let you carry this alone for so long." "You didn't let me carry anything, Mom. I chose not to correct the story. That was on me, not you. Still, I should have asked better questions. I think we wanted an easy story. It made things simpler." She ran a hand along the edge of a nearly finished dining table, one I'd spent the better part of a month restoring for a client in Charleston. "This is beautiful work, Larkin. I don't think I ever really told you that." I understood, standing in my own workshop, surrounded by the tangible proof of 3 years of quiet, deliberate work, that my mother's apology, imperfect as it was probably the closest I was going to get to real acknowledgement from my family, and that it was enough. Odalise called me a month later, late at night, her voice shaking in a way I recognized instantly. She'd finally asked Grant for full access to their accounts, and the conversation that followed hadn't gone well. She wasn't ready to leave, not yet, but she'd started, quietly, the way I once had, gathering information, understanding her own financial picture, building the kind of independent footing that meant she'd have real choices whenever she was ready to make them. I don't know how my sister's marriage will end. That's not my story to write for her. What I do know is that the 3 years everyone assumed had broken me were actually the 3 years I built the most solid, independent life I'd ever had, entirely on my own terms, and that finally saying that truth out loud, at a dinner table full of people who decided they already knew my story, was one of the most freeing moments of my entire adult life. I think, for a long time, I believed that staying quiet was a form of strength, that not needing anyone's understanding proved something about how far I'd come. I understand now that there's a different kind of strength in finally letting people see the truth, even when it's inconvenient, even when it disrupts the comfortable story they'd built around you. Marcus and I have started seeing each other again, slowly, carefully, on terms that feel genuinely mutual this time, built on a foundation I trust because I built it myself first, before I ever let anyone else into it. I'm not in a hurry this time, and neither is he, and something about that unhurried pace feels like its own kind of victory after everything. If there's one thing I hope you take from my story, it's this. You don't owe anyone a dramatic reveal to prove you've survived something. But you also don't have to let people keep believing a story about you that was never true, especially when correcting it might help someone else recognize a pattern before it costs them as many years as it cost you. Thank you so much for staying with me through this whole story. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. We share a brand new emotional true story just like this one every single day here on Calm Stories Drama. Drop a comment and let me know, honestly, would you have corrected the story the way I finally did, or would you have kept letting them believe what was easier? And if you want another story about family, betrayal, and the truth finally coming to light, there's another one waiting for you right now, and I promise, it will not disappoint. I'll see you in the next one.